And when I became the pastor of Northwood Church in 2005, because I had coached people at Wooddale for nearly 15 years, had recruited and coached people to do that in our services, and it was so well received at Wooddale. In fact, often I would hear, as when in the midst of Leith Anderson's great preaching, people would often say to me, "No, that's my favorite part of the service when people share their story."
Mm.
It was something that I purposely brought with me from Wooddale to Northwood Church, that we would do faith stories in our services on a regular basis. And it's been equally well received. And again, I hear often the comment, Brian, no offense against your preaching, but I really like those stories.
Yeah. How long have you been using the faith stories in your Sunday meetings at Northwood?
Well, since I came as the interim pastor in 2005.
And how frequently do you incorporate faith stories into your Sunday meetings?
Well, if you have a typical month of 4 Sundays, we will do them approximately 3 Sundays a month.
Could you kind of describe the coaching process that you use to prepare people to tell their faith stories?
Sure. Well, the coaching process actually begins with the recruitment of people to do their faith story. So how do you find people to do a faith story? Well, the best example I would know is that if you're a preaching pastor or speaking pastor, you know that you're always scouting for good illustrations and good stories to share in your sermons. And the same thing is true of the faith stories. You're always sort of scouting for a person or the people that are going to be candidates to share their faith story. So doing membership interviews with people, personal appointments with people. I sometimes will go back through my calendar the last 2-3 months when I'm scheduling faith stories, recruiting people, and jog in my mind, who have I talked to and what have they shared with me about what's going on in their life, because sometimes it's hard to keep track of all that. There have been a few times I've actually gone through the membership directory or the attendance directory of our church. There's about 500 people, and who is it that maybe has a story? I will literally pray before I go through the directory and say, Lord, who here has a story that you want people to hear? And so I developed kind of a prospect list, and then I will look at the preaching schedule for the next 3 to 4 months out. And typically I try to work at least 2 months out in the faith stories, and I really shoot for 3 months. So people, this is not like next week will you share your faith story. This is several months and several weeks so people can think about it and be working on it and give their best effort that way, their best thinking on it, as well as because it takes time to coach them if you need to do any editing with their story. So I will schedule it out, and I'll try to, if it's possible, if there's a theme that we're talking about in the message or the service, if I know that person's story that might connect with that theme, then I'll try to make that connection. Although what I have found over the years is, you can kind of try to force that, and God has this amazing way of, when you're working on your sermon or the service, the person that has been scheduled, God makes some supernatural connections between their story and your service theme and your message theme that it really is only from the work of God. So it begins with recruitment and then the ask. I have found too that over the years in doing this, that when I email somebody or I talk to them, and I've discovered over the years, especially most recently, that email is a better approach for me to invite people as compared to the personal call on the phone. The reason being is that whenever I would call somebody on the phone, the initial reaction was like, "Oh, you want me to do that?" I mean, people, as you know, their biggest fear is public speaking, and so they kind of get get taken aback a little bit, and they're kind of fumbling with their response. So often by the phone, I just simply would say, "Well, why don't you think about this and pray about this and see what you think," and then come back to them at a later time. So what I've discovered is if I email people, and in that email, invite them to do it, and in that email, explain the reason why I've invited them, then that really goes along with. Then they can kind of respond as they think about it, and they're not put on the spot to give an answer with something that you're kind of coming at them, which is a pretty big commitment for them to do. And then with the coaching, after the recruitment and the ask, then we send guidelines. We have written guidelines that are about a page in length that help people to think about what they're going to say. Some basic coaching principles in that are, again, this is your faith story, not your life story. So focus in on your faith and how Christ has come into your life, how Christ has changed your life. And then to pray about what they're going to say, to write it out. And we even the guidelines give the suggested length of how they write this out, that we have 5 minutes in our service devoted for the faith story. And that typically is about a page and a third or so, give or take somebody's speed by which they talk. About a page and a third of 12-point font, single space lines and margins. So, and we give that guidelines to them. And then the guidelines also is the request, the ask that they send me a copy of their story, typically 2 weeks in advance, typically. And in the week of, I'll do some editing with them if necessary, if need be. But I've discovered too that once this gets established in the church, people are hearing these stories week after week after week. And so they sort of have already in their mind, you know, if I were to say this or if I were to do that, they kind of know what sort of the culture is about, and they'll kind of self-edit is what I'm saying. They send me that copy, and then I look it over and give any edits or suggestions back to them. And then also including the guidelines are day of instructions, right? To make sure they know what do they do, what time do they show up at church? Because we want to have them come early enough that we include them in the pre-service prayer time we have with all the service personnel, that they get included in the talk through of the service order. So they're real clear about when they're going to be up in the story. Because sometimes we move the story around to different parts of the service. Typically it's at the same part every week, but we'll move it around every now and then for variety's sake. And if it's appropriate to do that. And then also we pray them up in that pre-service prayer time, so they feel the encouragement and they feel included in the Sunday morning schedule in that. So I think that's the sort of the coaching process. And there's a bit where you coach by the culture, you coach by the guidelines, and then you coach with just a little bit of suggestions here and there with regard to what they've written.
Have you ever seen any evidence that these faith stories are changing other believers in their scattered church ministries?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think one of the great outcomes, unintended outcomes, we think of these faith stories as really kind of to encourage people in the service, but people get inspired. They get fired up. And there's a personal connection that people feel with those sharing their story when they say, I can do that. Or they say, me too. They identify with what the person is saying. So I think they leave services more equipped and inspired to be a witness, to share a witness, and be bold and courageous for God because of what they hear. They expect a pastor to get up and talk about these things. And that's kind of our occupation. That's our job. But when somebody from the church talks about being a witness and shares a story of how they're trying to be a witness, it just really is, that's gold.
That really sounds like spurring one another on then.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, very good. Why do you record the faith stories, and any accounts of how these recordings have been used to equip other believers in the scattered church?
Yeah, well, we record them like we record all the messages. We're a medium-sized church. We're a church that worships right now 270 people on a Sunday morning. So we're not a big church, but we're not a small church. We're kind of that church in between. And we don't have a staff person designated to put the recordings on the website that we have. So we have a volunteer that does that, and it's a bit of a challenge, honestly, right now to get consistency with regard to getting all get those faith stories put on the website, even get the sermons put on the website. So I would imagine that if you're in a church our size or even smaller, you understand the challenge of that as compared to having a paid staff person who this is their job every week to put it on there. But I do know that when it's on there, people have gone there. Our metrics the reports that we get of people who visit our website tell us that people do visit that. I think, though, that one of the great things that happens in this is that the person who shares their story, they will often let their family and their friends know about their doing their story, and that will bring their people to church. In other words, their crowd comes to listen to them. And that also, if people hear that story, they will encourage others that they know that might connect with that story to go listen to the story. So there's it spreads its way out in a network in a positive way, in a good way.
You may already have covered this, but looking back over several years of experience with faith stories, what key insights have you gained?
Well, here's a couple that I thought about, Larry. First of which is that these are just really powerful spiritual moments in our congregation. It's not uncommon for there to be tears, either from people listening or people sharing. As people share their stories, sometimes are kind of they're moved themselves with what they're talking about because it's deeply personal. And for people who listen, I know I get often moved to tears because I know more of the story than sometimes is being shared. So they are powerful moments emotionally, but also spiritually. Spiritually, the truth that Jesus Christ changes lives. That's the consistent message. And that is a wonderful truth to communicate every week. And then also, I think an insight is just the relationships that get built because of this. I think it was C.S. Lewis who said sort of his definition of community is me too. When people understand that they thought they were the only person who either struggled with that or had that thought or that experience, but when they hear somebody else that has that experience, then they say me too. And I think that happens with the faith stories. People sit there and go, me too, and with what the person is sharing. And then, as I mentioned also, often a person who's sharing their story will invite family and friends to come listen, and those become evangelistic opportunities, evangelistic moments, because not everybody's cousin or brother or parent is a believer. And when they come and they listen, it's a powerful influence. A good example of that was this last Easter, a woman who is a newer believer to our church, a newer believer and newer to our church as well. I asked her to do her faith story, and Deanne did that. And there was probably 15 to 20 people from her world most of whom that don't go to our church and don't go to church period, that came to listen to Deanne. And they heard Deanne's faith story, which is really clear about how Christ has changed her life and given her victory over a struggle with alcoholism and drug use and just poor living, poor choices. And then they heard the message of Easter. And it was really, I thought, just a powerful Sunday for that. So they're powerful moments. They are essential to our worship. It's hard for me to imagine now services without faith stories. Another key insight I would say is one person needs to own this. This is something that somebody needs to manage and lead and do. So in other words, one person who says, I'm going to lead that. I'm going to make sure we do that. So they schedule the faith stories, they recruit the people, they coach the people. Now also I should mention that while I'm that person for Northwood Church, there are times I hand off that responsibility to one of my staff members. So for instance, last Sunday, our children and family pastor was speaking, and it was a holiday weekend, and we had just come off vacation Bible school a week and a half earlier. And so I asked him to recruit a child that would be able to do the faith story. And so he did that, and he recruited a 10-year-old child who gave her faith story, which, if I could just do a little parenthesis here, Larry. So last Sunday, and kind of along the lines of what you advocate for in your writing. So last Sunday, we had a 10-year-old child share a faith story, but a 67-year-old man, a Vietnam veteran, because it was the July 4th weekend, we prayed for our country. I asked him to pray for our nation, for our country. And of course, and he included the military in that. And then we also had a time of personal, private, silent prayer for everybody in the congregation, praying for a mission team that was in the Pine Ridge. So, and then we had in the worship team, we had a teenager, and we had a recently retired man, and then other band members as well, more middle-aged. But we just sort of had the gambit of ages. And I, at lunch with my wife, I just said, wasn't that great?
No, I love it. I love it.
Well, it was the church gathered, but the church, all of us from 10 years old to 70 years old, participating and leading in ministry in that. But anyway, back to it. So one person owns it and schedule it. And then also, I can't say this enough, this is a faith story, not a life story. And I think as you get started with doing this, that's going to be a bit of a challenge because, you know, some people may feel strongly about, well, I need to include this, but, you know, it's important to them, but it's not really going to be helpful to the story. And you need to keep the main thing, the main thing. And the main thing is about how Christ has changed your life. And so to help people understand that is really critical. And I would say this last key insight is get started, you know, maybe just do one a month. I know some of the daughter churches have started that way. And even some of the people that worked at Wooddale when I was there. Let me give you a great story, a good example of that. There was an intern we had that, and as he graduated from seminary and went to a church in Kansas, he thought faith stories was a great idea. So he got there, he was an associate pastor, he convinced the senior pastor to do it, and then they recruited somebody to do it, and the person went for 17 minutes. They went on and on and on. And within 3 days, within a couple of days after the faith story, he emailed me and say, "You have guidelines, right? Can you please send me a copy of those guidelines?" So the importance then of, as you get started, to sort of set the standard for what is going to be done. So make sure you have written guidelines in place. Make sure the people that you started with are people that you have some confidence in how they're going to do this. That it's like often, you know, when you lead a small group, often the person who asked the question, the opening question, will lead with an answer. When you're talking about the icebreaker, sort of set the tone for. So this is sort of like the standard or the expectation or kind of what it is that you're looking for. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. In fact, you've really anticipated the last question, is if you were going to suggest to someone, church leader, how they could start this in their church. But I think you've already touched on that. Anything more that you would say in terms of how to really equip them to equip others to help believers out there in the scattered church?
Yeah, I would say begin with prayer about doing this. I would say put in place the support systems you need to get. I'd be happy to share our guidelines. I took the guidelines that we drafted at Wooddale and morphed them into Northwood version. And so I'd be happy to email anybody our guidelines, and then they can take a look at it and make it fit their context, their culture, and then begin with people that you have confidence in terms of doing the story, the first couple. So you have a good sense. I would say this, in some ways, a faith story is, some of us grew up in the life of the church and we remember testimony night, on Sunday night services when we had those, or we remember, in church camp, the Friday night testimony time around the campfire. This is kind of more of a formalized thing. It's the same deal, but it's just formalized and it's brought into the context of the Sunday gathering, not those the Sunday morning worship service, not those other gatherings. I would also mention this that I think is a really interesting connection. So I subscribe to Christianity Today the news magazine. It's kind of the gold standard for, I think, news magazines for Christians, for pastors and for leaders. And I don't know if you've noticed this, but in the last year or two, they have now included in the back page article a faith story, a written faith story. And when I get my Christianity Today magazine, what is the first article I go to? I don't even look at the table of contents. I just go right to the back page because they have a faith story there. So one of my close friends, my former colleague at Wooddale, John Somerville, is on the board of CT. So I emailed him just this last week to say, John, did you have any influence with Christianity Today publishing these faith stories in the magazine? Because I've noticed them and I really like them. They're really powerful. And John emailed me back and he said, no, he didn't have influence, but it has been one of the most well-received articles now in Christianity Today, that they get all kinds of positive response and feedback from the faith stories in CT, in Christianity Today. So I think we're onto something that's really important with these.
Oh, this is great. If someone did want to get your guidelines, what is your email address?
Sure. It's Brian.Doten, so BRIAN .Doten, DOTEN, Brian.Doten at Northwood.cc. Again, at Northwood.cc. CC stands for Community Church. Yeah, I'd be happy to send those guidelines out.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your taking the time to spend with us, and I'm sure that what your comments have included are going to be a great help to many people. So thank you, Brian, and Lord bless. And
all right, you too, Larry. Great to visit with you.
Okay, yeah. Bye-bye.